Thank you for joining us. I am Drew Armstrong, the executive editor of Endpoints News, and welcome to Post-Hoc Live. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Post-Hoc Live. I am Drew Armstrong, the executive editor of Endpoints News and your host. It's June 9, and today we are going to talk about money. Every year, our senior correspondent, Andy Dunn, takes a good, deep look at what the top CEOs in biotech and pharma make, and they make a lot. Our best paid CEO has a package worth almost $250 million. Now, this year, Andy got into not just what CEOs make, but also how workers are paid. And he looked at executive perks, what scientific leaders make, and even golden parachutes for companies that get bought out. We'll talk about all of that in a few minutes. Little housekeeping first. If you're joining us for the first time, hello. Post-Hoc Live brings you the reporting, the analysis, and the debate that usually happens behind the scenes in our newsroom right to you. If you're joining us on YouTube and you're not already following us, please hit that little subscribe button below in our feed to get alerts about future live streams. You can also sign up for the Post-Hoc email on your endpoints.news subscription page. I apologize for my voice, dealing with a little bit of a summer cold. It's one of the hazards of having a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old at home. But we will do the show nonetheless. Andy, welcome. It's great to be with you. I love this series. You run this thing every year. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And I know it's one of the most read things that we do every single year when we publish this. Andy, let's get this started. Tell me, just to start with, like, why did you decide to start looking into CEO and employee pay? How do you go about this? And then we'll get into what you found. But I just want to kind of understand the origins of this project a little bit.
Yeah, it's been crazy enough, almost 10 years maybe since I first started looking into this. I think it starts with, pay is just so, to put it simply, so important and fundamental to any business. Um, I think the importance then combined with when I was starting out as a business reporter, just this sense of like surprise and awe that you could just sort of look up through some SEC regulatory filings, some level of compensation info. And it gets into the nitty gritty as far as really boards of director having to explain in pretty, interesting detail the components of pay packages, what went into their decisions, and how much they actually decided to pay their top executives every year. Um, so that's how it started, and then it's kind of just snowballed into this bigger and bigger thing every year. Where I think there's part of me that is always just interested in the long tail of the biotech industry. So not just sort of thinking about the 20 multinational pharmaceutical giants, but thinking of the hundreds, multiple hundreds of sort of smaller biotech companies that make up the entire ecosystem. And that's just been super interesting to see the similarities, differences in pay, both at the CEO and now also at the employee level.
And just to get us started, I mean, walk me through, like, what goes into an executive pay package? Because I think we see these headline numbers, $250 million, $80 million, $40 million. And that's obviously not in cash. Not even the majority of that is in cash most of the time. What makes up a CEO pay package? When we see these headline numbers, walk me through the methodology of what you include and how CEOs get paid.
Yeah, the short answer is it's almost entirely based on equity, and that could be a range of everything from restricted shares to stock options. Some of these are tied to certain conditions. You'll have some that probably most people are familiar with the idea of sort of restricted stock in the sense of maybe a vest over a certain period of years before you can sort of exercise or sell those shares. Or some have performance options, which might be tied to um, not just sort of basing your compensation around equity, but adding a level of you have to hit X, Y, and Z goals to actually earn these shares. So most CEOs in corporate America get paid probably at least 90% now in what would be called at risk compensation. that's just sort of what board and compensation consultants have, driven the trend on, which is the argument is this aligns CEOs sort of windfalls with shareholders. If the company does well, if the stock does well, the CEO will do well personally. So that is, 90, 95 to 99% of most of these pay packages. And if you go through the top 25 CEOs by pay for the past year, that's the story for most of them. And there's exceptions to the rule. And those are also interesting and just sort of why are they exceptions? So to point one out, just to get a sense of what else is out there, Royalty Pharma is this large buyer of royalty rights across the biopharma industry. So they don't actually develop or market drugs on their own. It's more of a financial driven model of seeing good opportunities in that long term of scooping up royalty rights and then seeing those pay out. The CEO for that company has for years and years been paid more in a style that would be similar to a Wall Street or boutique investment bank in the way of more performance fees based on those sort of quarterly receipts of that royalty portfolio. This story also, it kind of gets into this is the transition year for Royalty Pharma, where they actually sort of the company bought that internal holder that was behind that previous arrangement. So it's a long way of saying in the future they will actually probably look more like all the rest of the list in terms of having an equity heavy pay package. But yeah, it's primarily equity. Yep.
So one of the things I thought was really interesting that I noticed is that, you know, the very top of the list CEO wise is not necessarily made up of the very biggest companies in in the world. I mean, they're on there for sure, but they aren't at the top. So like if I'm a biopharma executive and I want to get a really great pay package, one of these, if I want to be number one on our list, where should I go and work? What kind of company should I go and work at?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think that is also surprising. Usually, is you would if I had to guess blindly of who would be at the top of the list year after year, you would think it would be Pfizer, Lilly, Gilead,
Yeah, these like,
Amgen.
almost Lilly's a $1 billion, or sorry, almost $1 trillion market cap company. Pfizer's massive J&J, and yet like they are not necessarily at the very top of our list.
Yeah, some of them are on there. So don't cry too many tears for Dave Ricks or
He's
Albert
doing all
Bourla.
right.
They're
Yeah,
doing okay.
Dave's fine.
Not at the top, but pretty good. I'll take 30 to 40 million as well in compensation. But I think the main difference is for big pharmaceutical companies, you see more consistency in pay packages year over year, in a more steady increase where you might go from 20 to 22 to 25 to 28 in total comp year over year versus in biotech where you have kind of these spiky totals that put some of these smaller. I always have some companies on the list that I have never heard of, which always humbles me in part because I feel like I'm pretty obsessive about trying to know all the names in biotech, but also just speaks to the long tail of the industry. So some of these spikes, and some of them are caused by weird aberrations where you might have a board modifying existing stock options that they're accruing now significant value, and then they sort of change the conditions after they've invested, and they have to report that to the SEC of sort of that marginal increase in fair market value that those changes drive. And as far as, I mean, for more practical advice, because this makes up probably maybe half of the list every year, is newly placed sort of first year CEOs in a range of biotech companies, and those generally think mid cap, anywhere from 1 billion to $10 billion companies that are looking to make that next jump.
Mhm.
Clearly, the boards put some serious budget behind landing someone that they believe has the background and the bona fides to sort of bring that company to the next level. And
And
those
those
are
are just
usually
like,
also massive first year pay
yeah,
packages.
just really big incentive packages of stock that may or may not pay out. How do those, I mean, what do we know? What do you know about when we look back at years past? I mean, we see these eye-popping numbers that are at risk compensation. Like, do these end up paying out? Like, how do I assume that certainly not everybody's that ended up on our list of compensation when we look at risk money actually would be there 5 years later if we were looking at the cash they brought in.
Yeah, that's an interesting future analysis I'd love to do because you could look at also it just takes even more legwork on sort of realized compensation, which is, with this series, I'm more interested in getting a sense of what is, in control the decisions the board controls in determining the size of the pay package for 2025. The way you see the story of sort of generational wealth when we start to see billionaires be created by biotech, that often comes from, yeah, these stock awards that have vested over years and years and years. And that, Regeneron is probably the poster child of this with Len and George. They're co-founders of 35 plus years. They are both billionaires now, thanks to the success of Regeneron. But that kind of reminds me of, the lottery odds that you typically see with drug R&D, where most aren't going to make it. I think that generally probably correlates with pay packages, but also every once in a while you see exceptions where even through some failure, boards revisit some of the more ambitious targets set out, and sort of halfway through the evaluation period will lower the bar to make, so sort of refresh pay packages. And the argument for companies is that retains the talent. You don't want demoralized people with sort of underwater stock options. They don't have
Mhm.
much to stay. Um, Versus, sort of resetting the playing field at certain times.
What surprised you this year in terms of who made the list or how the list has changed or the amounts have changed?
Yeah, I think the sheer amounts are always staggering to me. And just to see, this is the first time at Endpoints, in 4 years of doing this, that I had to raise the minimum of what it means to be highest paid. It used to be good enough if you were making 20 million plus in your pay package as a CEO. This year is the first year. I think the cutoff for that list was about 37 or 38
Wow.
people. Normally, that's been more in the range of 20-ish. So the new cutoff for is now at 25 million, and that still had 25 executives clearing that bar.
Is is
So
is that
numbers,
reflective of something? Yeah, is there something that's changing that's driving that? I mean, obviously, we're kind of in boom times for biotech and everything like that. I mean, not boom times necessarily, but things are certainly better than they were a few years ago when we were in the downturn. And these are, we
right.
should emphasize, these are 2025 pay packages. So I wouldn't be surprised if your bar continues to rise when we report 2026 numbers.
Yeah, the way this year has started, it would be shocking to me if it does not stay at 25, if not have to be raised even further next year. I've seen consistent, median CEO pay salary was 5.35 million. So that takes into that account that long tail of the industry. That's up 13% year over year. And that tracks about what I've seen for increases over, the past few years or so.
Well, and I want to talk about this year because, this week, like every week, we wake up on Monday, there's some major new deal announcement. We've seen a ton of deal making and company takeouts. An analysis you have coming out later this week. It's Tuesday. This is going to be a 5-part series. We have the story on CEO pay that was out yesterday, median employee that's out today. Then we're doing some stuff on executive perks, as well as M&A golden parachutes. What did you see when you dug into the golden parachute analysis you did? Because I think that's always, one of the most interesting things to see, not just the incentives that executives have when they are in the job, but then the incentives that they have to make sure that they're aligned around potentially selling the company and not holding on to power. Like, how do those golden parachute packages shape up? Why are they constructed the way they are? And what are you seeing in those?
Yeah, so these are basically, effectively exit packages for top executives where to exactly like you said, this is the thinking here behind golden parachutes is you don't want, the CEO pay is pretty good. You might not want to take the risk of selling your company if that puts you out of a job. So the thinking back in the 1980s, when we saw sort of, a lot of speculative M&A deals was incentivized financially executives. So today, that looks like a lot of sped up vesting on equity that drives these packages. That would sort of take either out of the money stock options, or shares that haven't yet vested yet with other conditions, and cashes those out for an executive through the premium usually of the M&A deal. As far as what's surprising, and I think this ties both of the pieces together with CEO pay and golden parachute pay. Um, there's very few checks in the world of executive compensation, and one of the only checks comes from shareholder pressure. From you start with sort of the advisory firms like ISS and Glass Lewis. and then that kind of can influence certain votes, which are mandated by Dodd-Frank back a little over a decade ago, which essentially is asking shareholders, it's a say on
Yeah,
pay
say on pay. Yeah,
advisory vote.
right.
Yeah, these were some of the most interesting cases that I came across, which is to start with the golden parachute side for Exact Sciences for Kevin Conroy, the former CEO of Exact.
Hmm.
Um, we saw both his CEO compensation for 2025 end up on the list, partially driven by the board deciding to accelerate the award schedule on certain equity, with the idea of getting around an IRS rule that is designed to impose an excise tax on excessive M&A payouts. And there's a level of boldness in this that I appreciate, where it's just, I mean, apparently this is totally fine legally to say we are trying to maneuver around this
Around
IRS
this,
law.
can you explain this a little, that excise tax a little bit more? What was that, and when did that happen, and why? And did you see other cases of this as well?
Yeah, it is increasingly common when you sort of see these golden parachutes, is there will be some discussion around, usually the jargon would be mitigation of 280G. That's an IRS rule. I think this came out of kind of the heyday of these M&A takeovers, maybe in the 80s, 90s, as sort of a pretty direct way of Congress going about trying to discourage excessive M&A exit packages. And
Mhm,
I
mhm.
think it's effectively, a 20% excise tax applied if the size of the exit package is beyond a certain multiple of your normal salary and base over the past maybe 5 years or so.
Gotcha.
So that's generally how it works. And then there's all these, so basically with Exact Sciences, part of their decision at the board level was to accelerate some of the vesting or granting of equity awards, um, to get them on the books for 2025, knowing that the deal would close in early 2026, with Abbott overall. Yeah.
And all right, I gotta ask. I mean, how are workers doing in all of this? Because you have a story out today, which might actually be our most read. This is always one of the best read things we publish every year. Your 5-part series on CEO and executive employee pay. If you're not the CEO, how are you doing? And I think I'd ask the same question. Where do we see, what do we know about kind of pay levels across these? Because there's huge disparities, and I think some of those are kind of statistical and methodological, but there's other real differences in how employee and worker pay shakes out. Tell us what you looked at, what you see, and what you were surprised by.
Yeah, I think we might have a graphic laying out some of this comparing CEO to employee pay, but overall, it is a well-paying industry. Would be the take-home message, even for the typical worker. You see here, typical median biopharma employee made about 116,000 last year. Generally, these numbers are also this includes sort of total compensation in the similar style that CEO pay is calculated. So this is not just base salary and bonus. This would be salary, bonus, the fair value of equity granted in the past year. They can even include sort of healthcare benefits if they pay or subsidize for premiums and so on. So you can see there how it compares 46 to 1, is kind of the ratio across the industry. And then I also pulled this from some reporting from the Associated Press, that they had on S&P 500 employees at the median level is about 89, 90,000. So you see that biopharma pays, as a whole as an industry at sort of above, corporate America or the corporate world at large.
And are there, I think one of the things that always stands out, and probably throw some people, like when I've looked at this graphic before, a lot of times some of the companies that are at the very, very highest end will be some tiny biotech you've never heard of. And I assume that that's a factor of, this is like a 15-person kind of C-suite and founders only. They've outsourced everything else. Maybe they're preclinical or just entering the clinic, and like it's basically a bunch of executives. And so there's some methodological skewing that happens there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. That was something that I think, I found a better fix this year, and please send your feedback too on how I could improve my methodology, because I know there's probably some scientists watching that have better ideas. But this year I used sort of a headcount adjusted median calculation of essentially controlling for that variable. Because yeah, at the top end, you could imagine there's a lot of firms that are 10 or 20 people. Half of them are executives, the other half are PhD level scientists that are kind of in senior roles too. And you'll see, the median employee pay for this group of 10 or 20 or maybe 50 people can be 400, 500,
Mhm.
700,000 in some cases. Um, when you look at the large pharmaceutical giants, those numbers are more, what you might expect somewhere more in line with this 116 figure.
Yeah.
Given there's the range of roles, the entry level workforce, part time workers, elements
Manufacturing,
like
sales, yeah.
yeah. So yeah, it also is. I mean, I think the practical advice there too is if you are looking to maximize your total compensation and you're thinking about the drug industry, look at small biotechs, figure out what roles they are hiring for and they value. Because I think the interesting through line of all of it is that pay is kind of the clearest, most direct sense of how a company values each of their employees.
Yeah.
What
But
tasks
there, I
are they
mean,
willing to pay for
you've
and how
got
much?
there's some very, pretty sizable companies at the top of that median list. I mean, I'm looking at, companies, like for example, the like Cytokinetics, commercial stage company, a median pay $425,000. You look at Bridge Bio on there. Again, a mature mid cap market, mid market cap, biotech company, close to $400,000. There not every company here is out of the 100 and 80 some, I believe, that you have on the list, is necessarily like some tiny 10 person biotech. And so I think it's we have a tool you can go and you can search and you can check this stuff out, and you can look at your company and the company where your friends work at, or the company where you almost got a job or thought about applying for a job. I think it's I'm not sure what if we're putting good feelings out into the world with this thing, but it certainly is interesting. So
Yeah, I think it's a basic level of transparency too. Again, this is some of the most closely guarded data where if I ever try to go and ask companies just directly for this and say, this would be it would be one interesting reporting, valuable to our readers, and to have more transparency on how companies decide what to pay and who to pay. Uh, they're not eager to give this stuff out. So this is sort of buried in these regulatory filings that are hundreds and hundreds of pages and mandated by recent laws around the. I think the Dodd-Frank Act is again behind the disclosure on median employee pay as
hmm
well.
hmm
It's hard to say it's ever apples to apples because every company, like you think of headcount as one consideration. You can look in the methodologies of exactly how they calculate median employee pay. Some will include part-time workers, some will exclude them from that calculation, some will exclude certain geographic areas. So there's all these little caveats, but at least it gives some type of baseline across a wide swath of the industry.
And I would, you talk about transparency and companies not necessarily wanting to disclose this stuff. You've been doing this for a while now. What is the reaction to this every year? Either when go out and ask for comment, which you do. I know you do have a very careful process of going out to the companies where we name the CEOs and asking them for comment. I assume people do not love that they are included on this list.
Yeah, I have not had anyone thrilled. In years past, I've gone with like lean into the naivety sometimes or your optimism of like request interviews with each of the CEOs if they'd like to, discuss on the record.
Has
Uh,
anybody
uh,
taken you up on that?
no one has taken me up on
Yeah,
that. So my inbox is
wouldn't
open.
hold
If
my
you're on
breath.
this
Yeah.
list, that's a carte blanche opportunity for you to break some pioneering ground, and we can analyze how the board decided you did over the past year and if you're satisfied with your pay. Yeah, it's a topic people don't like to talk about publicly, but that's also the flip side of that is people love to talk about this privately. My own sources in the industry, this is something that I always get a million text messages the second this stuff publishes. A mix of like, I think a lot of just awe over like, where do you get these numbers from? And it is just SEC regulatory filings and, a lot of cleaning and scraping and making sure you know what you're looking at. Um, but yeah, it's
Yeah.
and it's always an audience favorite. It makes sense if I always think of if someone wrote this about the media industry and about journalism where I work, would I want to read it? And the answer is duh,
Yeah,
yeah.
of
So
course.
it's
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
something I keep returning to because it's
Yeah,
just, too
I think
interesting.
a truism that we discover every time we publish, this project or some other similar projects on, private jet flights and things like that is that, nobody wants to talk about what they're doing, and everyone wants to gossip with you about what everybody else is doing. And I think that that's, everybody's curious about this stuff. You also
And you
looked at,
see
yeah, sorry, go
also,
ahead.
I would just add, it goes I love the gossip element. Like, I do not want to diminish that. I think there's always value. It just, here's what people are talking about around the water cooler. But there's also this element, I mean, to the existential risk to the industry around public distrust turning into public hatred of the biopharmaceutical industry. This is almost never discussed as executive compensation, and what is the right level? What is the balance of how much to reward executives for taking on this risk, leading these companies?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
that's something that the industry never talks about when you listen to panels, when you listen to, read books about the topic of public trust and how to restore it. Um, I think it deserves a place when you look at initiatives, on the ballot in cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles on overpaid CEO initiatives, which are looking to sort of potentially impose, again, excise taxes and penalties on companies and CEOs that earns a certain, ratio above their median employee
Yeah.
pay. So,
Well, I mean, and
um,
I think to your point, I know we get some pushback on this every year, but I think, one of the things, and a credit to you, is that, you've kept your methodology remarkably consistent and I think fair. And also all this data is publicly available. It takes, I know, a lot of work to put this together. How long does this take you to get done?
I, you know, if I knew how many hours, I'd probably have a mini life crisis over it of how many hours I've devoted to going through this. You know, I would guess it probably takes a good 40 hours or so, like all said and done, maybe if I had to completely guess. But we do have a bit of the behind the scenes here of just a quick screenshot of this is kind of what I've built over the past few years, and of just kind of you see all the
Yeah, you
companies,
have
their
this
market capitalization.
unbelievably rich data set. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, CEO pay, headcounts, median employee pay. And to me, this spreadsheet acts as almost like it maps out the world of biopharma to me. So it has benefit to me beyond just the narrow use of pay, is getting a sense of, what is the landscape of
All
this
right.
industry.
So for the folks who are, I'm sure, waiting for the next installment on this, what else do we have coming up this week that people should be watching out for that they'll get in their inboxes at midday every day when we publish
Yeah,
the rest
we
of
we've
these?
we've talked about golden parachutes, so be on the lookout for that. We'll also have, this is new for this year, is top paid chief scientific officers and chief medical officers. So the
Hmm.
doctors and scientists who are making the most money in the industry for 2025, and that looks at, I think, a bar of 10 million plus paydays. And then lastly, we'll also have a story on kind of the perks and oddities that I found within pay packages, which is sort of um, unusual line items that sort of caught my attention. So that'll be a fun one. I think we have time for
Any? Can you?
Friday.
Yeah. Can you give me any hints there? What stood out on the executive perk side that you saw?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, there is the classics of your private jet and how much you can rack up as a benefit of your personal use of said private jet. That is kind of standard fare now for most big pharmaceutical companies, but um, there were some interesting ones on, housing allowances, recurring housing allowances for CEOs, to, at some biotechs that are actively trying to cut cost and sort of have had major layoffs in recent years. You see the persistence of things like expensive leased cars for all the executives. And when you look at the value of how much that cost the company, I think the question I pose to them is, is that necessarily worth it sometimes? Particularly
Yeah.
including, I think one of the interesting things is some of the personal benefits companies and boards will decide to also cover the additional tax payments you owe on that. If it's a personal benefit to yourself, you might owe taxes as a result of that. these companies will say the shareholders will also pay for those taxes. So that's called a tax gross up. So on the leased car one at one of these companies, those executives don't have to pay for the taxes of also getting these leased cars as well. There's some more interesting ones in there too, but
Yeah, well, I can't wait to read that one, and I'm sure other folks can't either. Is one of the best things and one of the most interesting series we publish every year. You put a ton of work into it. The whole team does here as well. I know there's a great cast of folks behind the scenes who've been editing and working with you on the data, getting this great show ready. And I can't wait for us to be able to publish the rest of these stories this week. I hope you all have time to check them out. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us. We'll be following along with this topic and every piece of breaking news very closely. You can keep up with our coverage at endpoints.news or by subscribing to our newsletters. The recording of this conversation is on YouTube, and the audio will be up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. If you've already signed up for our Post-Hoc newsletter, you'll get notifications next time we have a broadcast coming up. And if you're not, head over to endpoints.news. In the top right-hand corner, hit the reader profile link, then preferences, and click to activate Post-Hoc. You can also follow us on X, LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and Blue Sky by searching for Endpoints News. Huge thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, and our engineer, Dalen Turk. We will see you the next time news breaks.